I waited as the old man took his time retrieving a fat manila envelope from a chest of drawers in the living room. I flipped through the wad of bills inside after he handed it to me. "You ain't gotta worry," the old man said. "It's all there." I traveled a ways down a back country road to get to the farmhouse. Once majestic, the tendrils of decay had grasped hold of this house. Great big flakes of white paint had peeled off the clapboard siding, revealing the dead timber underneath it. All things at the end will rot. The money was worth the trip. I charged a higher sum for this job because of its peculiar specifications. $80,000, half before, the other half after it was done. I retrieved a Polaroid, soon to be burned, that I kept folded in my back pocket. The old man put his hand out. "I don't need you to show me," he said. "I know you saw it through. I trust your reputation. Not much room for mistakes in your business anyhow. Treacherous as you might be, I can count on you to get a deed done." Treacherous? Old man had a lot of nerve speaking to me that way, given what he asked me to do. The old man had wanted the target shot, stabbed through the heart, and dismembered. He'd specifically instructed the target to be decapitated and his hands removed. Other than that, the old man had said, "Cut him up in any which way you like." From there I was to place the target in a burn barrel and light it ablaze. To say the old man wanted the target dead was an understatement. He wanted him annihilated, reduced to ash. I wasn't in the habit of asking paying customers why. Unless I needed information to get it done, I didn't want to hear it. But this time I wondered. I lured the target to a secluded place I won't identify, though I suppose it doesn't really matter. The first thing I noticed about him was that he was so much younger than the old man. Mid-20s tops, and that was generous. I couldn't imagine what the kid had done to make this old man so hell-bent on killing him. Couldn't have been business. I knew every single organized crime figure in the area, and the old man wasn't one of them. Had to be personal then. I still couldn't fathom what vendetta the old man had against a kid decades his junior, but I set the question aside and did my job. I couldn't keep the issue out of my mind for long. Inside the farmhouse, I noticed a frayed photo among the dusty picture frames scattered along the mantel. Though he was younger and less wrinkled in the photograph, I recognized the old man. He was picnicking in the field, one arm around a border collie dog and the other around a brown-haired woman. In front of the adults sat two children, a smiling young girl who looked much like her mother, and an older boy with a 1,000-yard stare. His gaze was unsettling. It was almost as if from that still moment in his past, he was sitting in judgment. Despite his age in the photo, I recognized him instantly. It's hard to forget someone you shot point blank. A hit of uncharacteristic compunction formed inside me. Most who met the barrel of my gun were folks as knee-deep in the underworld as I was, who done bad things to worse people and faced the consequences. This was different. "Your own son?" I asked. "I didn't think you asked questions," the old man said. "What was that kid? 25? What could he have done?" "He's a bit older than he looks." I looked at him for a moment, let him sense my distaste. The old man sighed. "I'll show you something, if you care to see." I followed the old man out behind the house to a tall, sturdy tree. In the shade under the branches was a weather-beaten makeshift cross. Daisy, it read, in faded black lettering. "She was a good animal," the old man said, reminiscing. "I've always liked dogs. Feel much softer about them than I do people. and if the old man's son had done something to the family dog, that was terrible, but I couldn't help feeling it warranted lesser response than a bullet. We walked back inside through the rear door. "Always something wrong with that boy," the old man muttered. "Born bad." "So that's it, huh?" I said. "It was about the dog." The old man shook his head. "He took his sister a couple years later, broke his mother's heart to pieces, and a few years after that he took her too." "Let me get this straight. You let your son kill your dog, your daughter, and your wife?" I tried to stop him. "You said all this happened several years apart. You didn't get him some help? Institutionalize him?" "It ain't that simple," the old man said calmly. "What's complicated about it? That boy ain't normal." The old man handed me two thin items out of the same drawer from which he produced the envelope. Laminated memorial cards of the sort handed out at funerals, complete with images of the deceased. One memorialized a young girl, the other an adult woman. Though they both aged a few years, there was no doubt I'd seen them in the photo on the mantel. What I found curious were the dates of death. The girl died in 1980, her mother in 84. Given the age of the kid whose body I burned in a 55-gallon drum, it wasn't possible for him to have killed the two. Matter of fact, it wasn't even possible for him to be the woman's son. I began to think the old man wasn't as sharp as he seemed. "It's about sundown," the old man said. "You don't want to be here out alone in the dark. Let me see you out." The old farmhouse was situated atop a grassy hill, and its grand front porch overlooked the road below. I was starting down the steps when the old man spoke. "Where'd you get rid of the body?" I told him. He grunted before shifting a rocking chair on the porch so it faced the east side of the road. He sat, adjusting his veteran ball cap before reaching to his side. For the first time, I noticed a pump shotgun leaned up against the house. I gripped the handle of the pistol I was concealing. "No need," the old man said, nestling the pump in his lap. "If I had a mind to shoot you, I'd have done it already." "If you're such a great shot," I said, "why'd you hire me?" "Shooting ain't my problem," he replied. "Done it plenty. First time I put a slug in him was when I seen what he'd done to Daisy. It was the sawing and the burning I needed you for. Don't have the stomach for it myself." "In any case," the old man continued, "you might should get on your way. If he comes back, he'll be angry, and despite our efforts, I reckon he will." I drove back east where I came down the road, feeling a bit troubled. This, I told myself, is why you don't ask questions. I try to forget about it, and I almost did, until I passed a solitary figure on the opposite shoulder. Just as the sun slipped below the horizon and the shadow overtook the two-lane road, I didn't need sunlight to know who he was. His face was already imprinted in my memory. He walked steadily, with purpose. The walk of a man who was coming home. I didn't stop or turn around. I just kept driving. I'd already done my job. Killing him twice. That wasn't part of the deal. Burned alive and buried alive. The two worst fates for any living creature that I could ever possibly imagine. If forced with a choice, which would you pick? Unbearable physical agony or extreme mental torture? the most excruciating pain imaginable, or the utmost form of horror that the human mind is capable of conceiving? Up to a few years ago, I didn't know either. Why would you even consider it if not forced to? Well, one day I found out which I choose. One day so dreadful that there's no adjective in the English language strong enough to properly convey the horror of it. A day so awful that I struggled just to recall it. I had the choice put upon me. Here is what happened. Years ago, I bought my first home. Being an overall fan of the macabre and living in rural New England, I decided on a nearly ancient American colonial-style home, reminiscent of something out of a Nathaniel Hawthorne or Arthur Miller story. It was a product of a bygone era. Though it was built in the early 1800s, as the cliché goes, it had good bones, and had been fairly well maintained considering its age. That being said, it still needed some work. A few weeks after closing, while fixing some of the faulty old wiring in the basement, I came across a centuries-old drain set in the stone flooring. It was maybe 3 feet in diameter and covered with a heavy iron grate that was worn with many decades worth of rough, brown corrosion. It resembled the entrance to a dungeon. Like I mentioned above, I have a curiosity for all the dark and morbid elements of the world. Finds like this were the exact reason I wanted this house. So I decided to have a closer look at the forgotten thing. I laced my fingers through the dirty old grate and gave it a firm pull. It opened with a pained and rusty cry. I gazed down into the hole. A faint, acrid stink arose from its depths. It was as dry as old bone and quiet as a crypt. I assumed, due to the home's location on the side of a small hill, that the basement had once been prone to flooding, and that the modern technological developments had rendered that, like so many other things in this place, a relic of the past. I poked my head a little farther in and looked into the deep, dark recesses of the ancient plumbing. I could make out just the faintest bit of light at the far end. I went out into the yard and found the outlet hidden deep in a thicket of tangled brush. Evidently lacking access to chicken mesh, someone had covered it with a makeshift crisscrossing of merciless-looking barbed wire, apparently to keep any unwanted creatures from crawling in during the night. I thought that whomever had done so had made a smart choice. The pipe looked nearly big enough for a person to squeeze through. A few months later, I was back working in the basement. The previous owner had left boxes upon boxes of yellow newspapers, books, and other forms of aged literature stacked under the stairs. I wanted to move out what I could as they were taking up a lot of valuable storage space and were a possible fire hazard, especially under the dry, splintery wood of the basement risers. Honestly, though, I really wanted to look through them to see what sort of curious old volumes might be hidden within the dusty mound. About 30 minutes into my task, I had sifted through and moved about 5 of the boxes without finding anything of much interest. In the 6th box, however, I came across a strange volume bound in worn leather that looked like it must be older than the house itself. It had the words Kitab al-Kanus embossed on the cover and was written in what appeared to be Arabic, though I'm no linguist. There were English translations or notes of some sort written in the margins. They seemed to say something about the locations of the lost and hidden treasures. This was the kind of thing I was looking for. Excited by my find, I moved out from under the stairs in search of a better lighting to read it by. I went over to a large floodlight I had left in the basement from the previous project and flicked it on. The decrepit wiring running under the stairs sparked violently. I spun quickly and in doing so, tripped and fell backward. By the time I got up, the sparks had already lit a fire in the stack of boxes that stood nearly a meter high. It was licking and biting at the withered stairs like the jaws of a hungry animal. In hindsight, at this very moment, I should have sprinted through the flames to safety. Whatever burns I would have suffered would have paled in comparison to the trauma I was doomed to endure by staying put. But like they say, hindsight is 20/20. Instead, I sat frozen in shock of the sight in front of me. When I snapped out of it, I looked around frantically for any sign of something to douse the flames with, but of course there was nothing. Nobody thinks to keep a fire extinguisher in their basement. The blaze rose higher, engulfing the staircase and spreading around the door jamb at the top like some kind of hellish decoration. I tried desperately to hold back panic and think of a way out. My basement had no windows and no hatchway either. Then the fire spread to the exposed fiberglass insulation in the ceiling. It jumped from section to section like a stone skipping across a pond. The air became thick with the baking heat. The sound of the flames crackling was now a constant and unrelenting. Smoke was filling up the already closed air, curling and twisting through the space. Every breath I took tasted of hot ash. I finally decided my only hope was to sprint up the stairs through the inferno and pray my injuries weren't life-threatening. Thoughts of pink stinging burns, blisters, wet peeling flesh, and skin grafts flashed through my mind. I hesitated. I tried to steel my nerves against it all. Then the staircase collapsed. I drew back against the concrete wall behind me, hoping for respite from the sudden gust of fiery air that followed. It didn't help. It was like standing too close to a bonfire, but with no way to back up. I looked up at the doorway. The threshold was 15 feet up and surrounded by flame. I moved away along the wall, desperately searching for any relief from the heat and smoke. Everything was on fire now. I could barely see. My eyes burned and every breath choked my lungs. I was beginning to feel lightheaded and nauseous. I was going to die down here, asphyxiated and burned alive. I prayed to God to feel as little as possible. I got down on my stomach, hoping to delay the inevitable. My hands felt cold metal on the floor. I heard it grind and shift with my movement. My fingers slipped through the elongated holes. I was lying on top of the drain. My heart jumped and then immediately dropped to the pit of my stomach. I had a way out, but it meant squeezing through hundreds of feet of suffocating underground tunnel. I pulled it open, and it gave that same rusty cry as before. I put my head inside. The air felt so cool and fresh compared to the basement. I looked at the speck of light way down in the darkness. It looked miles away. I tried pushing myself inside. My shoulders pressed against the sides of the drain, pinning my arms tightly to my sides. Claustrophobia hit me like an electric shock. I scrambled back up immediately. I couldn't do this. It was so narrow. I would get stuck in the pipe and slowly die in there, deep under the earth. I sobbed and cried out in utter despair. The fire was closing in around me. I could barely breathe anymore. The heat was like being in an oven, like baking to death. I felt flames lick at my back and I jumped forward. Fire burnt the skin of my face. I pulled back. I had nowhere left to go. Without stopping to think any further, I shoved my body headlong into that hole. I wriggled in like a worm, the flames burning at my feet and the legs giving me the dearly needed motivation to move forward. My arms were pinned to my sides again. Because of the L shape of the drain, I had to go in upside down. It was like being trapped in a coffin. It was like being stuck in a cave miles below the Earth's surface. Dread and anxiety like I've never felt before consumed me. I wriggled and squirmed and kicked. I moved mere centimeters with each desperate effort. The sides of the pipe clenched around me like a fist. Every move felt like it would wedge me hopelessly in the pipe. In my position, I couldn't even see where I was going. I had no idea how much progress I was making. If I was even getting closer to the opening. The darkness was total. I sobbed and screamed and squirmed further, scraping my skin on the rough sides of the dried up old pipe. My mind was pure panic now. I pushed with my legs all I could, but I only had room to lift my knees a few inches. I struggled wildly to keep moving. the sides of the cylinder grinding against my shoulders and hips. My manic breathing and hopeless cries echoed deafeningly in the pipe. Then I came to a rise. I could feel it like a ridge under my back. The buildup of centuries of rock, hard mineral deposits created a stalagmite-like formation underneath me that gradually rose up the sides of the passage. I kept pushing and squirming as feverishly as ever until I felt my shoulder squeeze right up against my neck. I kicked and I twisted and I yelled, but I could not move. I was pinned within the jagged ridge. There wasn't room to move forward, and I had no way to back up. I was stuck, completely and totally stuck. I thrashed my legs and jerked my torso violently. I whipped my head around and cried out like an animal in a trap, banging my forehead against the top of the pipe and scraping the skin off. Still, my body wouldn't move. I cried and I screamed until I was exhausted. Then I cried and screamed even more. I began to fade in and out. I dreamt that I saw the faces of the dead climbing out of the earth above me. I heard the voices of demons in my ears chanting and laughing at me in strange languages. I could feel the pipe squeezing and tightening and relaxing just to play with me. The world spun uncontrollably at times, making me dizzy and sick. Other times I floated paralyzed through the void. My thoughts whirled violently round my brain like mad biting flies. My head felt like an oven with my brain baking inside. The salt of my tears burned my dried up eyes. I was going to die in here, alone, stuck, unable to move. I completely lost my sanity during those hours. My consciousness turned to a soup of constantly churning, manic thought with nothing resembling rational or ordered cognitive activity remaining. Consequently, it was my wild animalistic screams that finally alerted the firefighters to my whereabouts deep within the pipe. They had to wait until the fire had died down before they could call in an excavator. Eventually, the heavy machine became too risky, as it could easily have collapsed a decaying old tube, burying me within. So they set to work digging it up with shovels, and after they moved enough earth to expose the pipe, they had to cut down the section I was entombed in with a large saw. I know people were speaking to me during this time, trying in vain to keep me calm, but all I remember is the deafening, metallic shrieking that echoed through the pipe, stabbing at my eardrums like ice picks. Once freed from the rest of the conduit, they lifted the section that held me out of the ground with a small crane and set it down in the yard. I vaguely remember another floating sensation. I had hoped that I had died. Soon they went back to work with smaller yet barely less hideous sounding saws. It was at night at this point, so I didn't even get the minuscule benefit of daylight to ease the suffering. Other than the noise, it felt no different than when I first crawled in. Finally, it felt as if the great weight was lifted from all sides of me. My body seemed to expand in all directions. Cool night air brushed across my skin. I was lifted up and carried away. This, like I said, was years ago. I am just now regaining the sanity needed to be able to process those events and write them down. My therapist tells me it's a good idea, that it will help me get past the event to whatever degree possible. He says it may help with the night terrors too. I can barely sleep without teleporting right back into that suffocating space. The other patients in the hospital are used to my nightly screaming by now. So are the nurses and the orderlies. It was they who gave me the details of my rescue. They told me I was stuck in that pipe for nearly 10 hours before the rescuers got me out. They also tell me that crawling into it was the only reason I survived. The house was nothing but a pile of ashes after the fire, and because of its subterranean location, very little heat or smoke got into that awful drain. So in the end, that nightmare is the reason that I'm alive and able to write this. Though if I could go back to that day, to that moment standing above the ancient grate, surrounded by roaring flame, I'm not sure I'd make the same decision again. I may let the flames take me. I may let myself burn alive. I'm shaking right now. I feel like my fingers are going to fall off if this keeps up. Yet, I can't keep this to myself any longer. It, is coming for me. And when I disappear, no one will ever know. I'll vanish without a trace, and the world will never know what happened to me. God, please, I know I don't go to church. I'm not a Christian. But if what they say is true and you do exist, please save me. Please bring my mom back. I'll do anything. It began only days ago, or not. It feels like it's been months, maybe years. I don't entirely know. My perception of time seems non-existent now, so much that I've become completely unreliable. I don't trust the date on my phone, nor on this computer. It's jumbled and twisted, like her. These words, as I type them, seem to skew and distort. It follows the current as it moves, just like how she follows me. My parents went out on a bike ride together. They got along well, rarely ever fighting, and they often went out together to exercise. I was perfectly happy to stay at home, keeping an eye on the stray alley cat we sometimes let in when it was cold, and amusing myself on YouTube or working on my book. My book will never be finished now. Of all the things to make me cry, that had to be it. This time was wrong though. I heard the front door open and I saved my project, and when I left my room to greet them, my dad was limping, blood smeared on his brow, and he was bleeding from his elbows. I asked what had happened, and my mom answered for him. He fell off his bike. That voice. It was certainly my mom's, but she sounded odd. The soft tones I had grown used to over 18 years were completely gone. Even when she was angry, her voice was still characteristically sweet at its core. I asked if she and my dad had fought, thinking perhaps that might be the cause of my confusion, but my mom told me that they hadn't. My dad smiled at me and told me not to worry, but while he seemed like, well, himself, his voice was strained, and his usually tan skin was atypically blanched. That was not what put me off, however. When I offered to help bandage the open wounds on his forehead and elbows, which were rather minor in comparison to whatever internal damage had caused his limp, he didn't protest. He just followed behind me wordlessly as I went to get the band-aids and neosporin from the medicine cabinet. My dad never let my mom nor I take care of him that way, without some verbal back and forth. My dad was kind but stubborn like a mule. He would always tell us not to fuss over him, though we inevitably would. My mom just stood there watching us, making no move to help my dad at all. He was limping, for Christ's sake. She would never have let that slide without checking to make sure his bones were all intact. They must have fought. That was the only reason I could think of for them to be acting like this, especially my mom. My dad's behavior worried me more, though. He wasn't the kind of person to act so fragile. I wish they had only been fighting. I wish that more than anything now. I hate when my parents fight, but at least they're both themselves when they do. God, I'm going to cry again, but I have to finish this. I have to keep going before it's too late and she catches up to me. Over the next few days, or perhaps weeks, I noticed little things were off. My mom didn't call me by my nickname at all, and she almost always did. When she used terms of endearment for me, they sounded forced, like she was reciting them through gritted teeth. I thought she might be on her period or something. I did everything to explain away the unusual behavior. Maybe the stress of at-home college and the pandemic was finally getting to me. Sure, that had to be right. My dad, though, he looked more and more like a ghost every day. There wasn't even a trace of a tan on his skin, and he was still going to work at the construction site. He was under the sun all the time, yet it didn't make a difference. He grew fainter until that gruff love I knew to expect from him had transformed into something breakable and wispy. He looked at me like he barely recognized me, beyond the signals of his brain telling him that he did. Then I found out why. It was feeding on him. Whatever creature had impersonated my mom, was feeding off of my dad. A vampire? Something else? The fuck if I know. All I know is that one day I told my parents I was going out. I should have noticed the pleading in my dad's eyes, even when he smiled and waved at me as I left. I should have seen the terror that he could not express in words. I remembered it only when I quietly snuck back inside through the back door, wanting to see exactly what was happening while I was gone. God, I'm still reeling from it, but I snuck through the kitchen into an adjoining hall where my parents' bedroom was. Our house was only one level, there were no stairs to climb, and when I pierced past the half-open door, I saw something that will haunt me for the rest of the little time I have left. She was on top of him, a beast that looked like my mom, but was bigger. Her body seemed to dwarf the king-size bed, and far stronger than my dad. Her skin was tight to her gigantic bones, and her spine curved at an unnatural angle as she leaned over him, long-fingered hands cradling my dad's head. Those animal claws of hers dug into his skin, and her pellucid tongue, which was long and spiked at the end, slithered like a snake into his mouth and down his throat. I nearly threw up. Even thinking about it now makes me want to vomit all over myself. My disgust and terror only increased when thick red blood, Dad's blood, traveled up the translucent tube with such a repulsive sound. I didn't know what the fuck to do. What could I have done? I backed away, trying to keep my heart from leaving my chest. It was pounding so hard. I know that I should never have stood there for as long as I did. I should have started running, but my feet felt like they'd been glued to the floor. My hands affixed to either side of my head in panic as my back pressed against the opposite wall. When the gulping noises abruptly stopped, I knew I was fucked. I looked up and her eyes were on me. My mother's face, attached by a skeletal neck to that colossal body. Those yellow eyes captivated me like prey. The door opened on its own. She picked up my dad's feeble body in one gigantic hand and threw him at my feet like a rag doll. His depleted form making a thud on the ground. He was breathing, but barely, and his eyes gazed sightlessly forward. I fell to my knees holding him and sobbing like I've never sobbed before. He was dying. This thing had killed my dad. Then she spoke, in my mom's voice exactly, now with the soft tones I knew. "You will be him," she told me. I could not see her. Through the tears. I didn't want to. I wanted to wake up. "You will taste sweeter than he did. You are young. I will make you last." I heard a screech, and the tears fell from my eyes, clearing them for but a moment. I saw my dad's arm holding her at her own bay with an impossible surge of final strength. His face looked more alive than it had in what felt like forever, and though no sound left his mouth, his lips said, "Go." I did what he asked. I ran. I flung the front door open and ran out, but I nearly fell when I heard the horrific crunching noise and my dad's gasps of pain right behind me. I ran for so long, never looking back. I'm at the library now. I'm on a public computer. This was the only site I could log into. The words are jumbled and the world around me is darkening quickly. I live near a police station, but when I went there, the building was simply gone, like it had never existed at all. I try to contact my friends, my family, 911, but I can't get hold of anyone. When I do get messages, they're from her. She says she's getting closer, how she can't wait to use my body and bleed me dry. This must be a horrible, horrible dream. It has to be. It has to be, please. Day 7. Blink. My name is Adrian Kagya. I know this. I am sitting against a floor of dust, my back absorbing the cold of the wall as I stare at the ground trying to get a grip of the last 7 days. I tell myself, this will pass. In a few more hours I will get back home, reward myself with a home-cooked dinuguan, and greet my students hello. My left arm is freshly cut to the shoulder, slowly bleeding out the rest of my life. I take a deep breath. My limb felt like being pounded between steel doors every half a second, my stomach aching like sharp teeth are eating their way out of my insides. I don't have enough strength to move. I am stuck in a dark corner inside a mall's hardware store beneath the ceiling that fell into a slope. Where is this goddamn rescue team? It had been a week since the earthquake. The air was heavy with gasoline and rot. Among the darkness, the dust, the broken shards of fluorescent lights, the limbs of those who did not make it, some blood, and darkness. A black existing by itself, in itself. Blink. Sasha squeezed my hand. We'll get through this, she assures. Her palm is soft against mine, warm even. It is only then that I realized I'd been trembling hard. I was trying to distract himself from the pain, staring at Sasha's face. I focused on her eyes, her long black hair, inhaled, then tried to relax. I felt the air imploding inside my lungs, thought about all the other things I will do after I was out of this ruin, then exhaled. Sasha smiles at me with her dimples burying inside her cheeks, and I managed to calm down a bit. She then helped me eat by hand-feeding me meat. For one demented reason, it felt good about having her stuck here with me. During the earthquake, the department store's upper floor collapsed. I thought that would be the end of it, but with God's holy miracle and a probability jackpot, the upper floor slumped to the side and fell into a slope, shielding my group from other falling rubble and left us untouched. Electricity was the first to go out. We made our way blind and lost in the dark. At first we were just happy that they survived, but as the days went on, we were forced beyond our limits. Joseph, one of the clerks, broke a water sprinkler straight to the pipeline, turning it into a source of water. It served as a solution to thirst, and was enough to fill a stomach that was empty of food. Although, of course, not completely. One needed protein and carbohydrates just as much as one needed oxygen. Blink. I chew, munch, and swallow. Once one gets too hungry to even consider the taste, one will stop thinking about what one eats and just focus on the fact that one is eating. Sasha yanked another chunk of raw flesh from my recently amputated arm, then proceeded to feed me of it. My teeth munch it like it's undercooked tocino. I savor my own blood like juice, squishing out between strands of meat. "Tutoy, thank you," Mr. Martin said. His voice is old and scruffy, but calm and gentle. He rose my shoulder, maybe trying to comfort me. "Your sacrifice saved us all, and that is the most important part." He continued his pep talk, and on a normal occasion his words would flow in and out of my ears. Mr. Martin's words reminded me of the old movies I used to see as a child. Those lines about nobleness, heroism, and other morality talk films wanted to prime in its audience. Today they were music to my ears. It was a rational decision. We all had sacrifices to make, and this one was mine. Yes, it was my arm, but what was a piece of limb compared to all the lives it could save? "Just one thing," Mr. Martin added. "Please don't tell my son what he's eating. He's been through enough." He turned to look at his 7-year-old son, whom they referred to as Junior, mindlessly eating a chunk of meat. Day 8. Blink. When I woke up, my throat was as dry as a drought, and my head was a spinning sandstorm. My fever wasn't helping either. Water is the first thought that I had. I was going to use my left hand to help myself up, and as I fell, I was immediately reminded of what I lost. I groaned, swearing I could still feel it. "Hey," Joseph came to help and walked me to the broken pipeline. Water rained from above, caught inside an empty tool bucket. Joseph carried the bucket up to my face so I could take a gulp. I let the liquid flow down my throat, as soothing as water soaking a dry soil. I closed my eyes, remembering the day of the earthquake, how I wouldn't be stuck here if I didn't make the small decision to buy a new screwdriver. It seemed like divine intervention for leaving us alive. Today it seemed like damnation for being given the slowest possible way of death. Sometimes the talking made things cozy. Even just for a moment we could forget about the situation they were in. Joseph and I had casual talks about the bad system of contractual work, since we both worked as salesmen once. Mr. Martin and his son shared stories about Europe, the countries they had visited, lightening up the topics a bit. And Sasha, a God-sent nurse, reminded us to be strong. She told us about her most hopeless patients and how people could survive and defy imminent death. That was, after we stopped trying to get out, after we accepted the fact that only bulldozers could destroy the walls and set us free. But as time went on, our shared hunger and paranoia fed their doubts. Today, I just sat on the floor and cried. We were long due for a rescue. It was an earthquake with enough magnitude to bring down a building. How come the rescue team are not here yet? How is it that I hear no machines outside or people shouting for survivors? Have they abandoned us? I didn't bother to wipe the tears from my cheek. I didn't bother to hide my weak sobs. Most of the time I thought about the idea of how being crushed under debris was better than eating yourself to death. Day 11. Every passing day is worse than before. My head is aching, my body is weak. Each second I felt like I was going to puke, but there was nothing to vomit. I can almost see my own hands ripping through my skin to my intestines. My stomach is banging, burning, yet bloated from water. In 2 days it would be Joseph's turn to sacrifice an arm. I could still feel the handsaw burying itself into my limb, the blade grinding against my bone. Soon there will be a new member of the Amputee Cannibals Club, and I didn't ponder a single thought about how hard it would be for Joseph to share my fate. The only thing I cared about was that in 2 days, I am going to eat. Day 13. Today I woke up to Mr. Martin's cries from a distance, screaming his son's name over and over again, shaking the walls, shaking my head. I scrambled to my feet, half awake. "I'm sorry," I could hear Sasha, speaking in a muffled sob. "I'm sorry I couldn't do anything." I rubbed my eyes as I sprinted across the rubble, stepping through stones, stepping against the palm of a corpse. My stomach growls, my head aches, my veins burn. There is Junior, lying motionless on the asphalt, his shorts torn on the left, revealing a narrow, swollen wound on his leg. The cut is yellowish, rotten, surrounded with dried blood. It started from his upper knee to his lower waist. The boy's eyes are open the whole time, never blinking once. His whole body was steady, stiff. Mr. Martin sat beside him, crying as he held his son, caressing Junior's cheek. Sasha beside them, and Joseph coming from a distance holding a handsaw. My stomach writhes and writhes and writhes. "Martin," Joseph mumbled, his face dripping with sweat. "There's nothing else we could do. Sasha tried everything," he continued, taking a slow step forward. "And I know he's your son, and I am sorry that I am saying this, but..." He paused. "All of us are hungry." Joseph looked at Junior, and I knew in that moment that those eyes weren't looking at a corpse, that those eyes were already looking at his food. It was the amazing miracle of death. "It's been 6 days since we last ate." "Don't you dare lay a finger on my son." Mr. Martin swept Junior into his arms. His voice was deep now, stern like that of a soldier commanding his platoon. "Look, I'm not a bad guy, and I know what I'm saying is wrong," Joseph reasoned out. "I mean, I'm supposed to give up my goddamn arm today." His hand closed into a fist. "But because this happened, maybe..." "This is my son's body." Mr. Martin's voice boomed through the room, his whole face turning red. "I intend to bury him whole." Sasha tried to squeeze in between, begging them to stop, pulling Joseph by the arm, but her words faded into white noise. I watched and writhed and writhed and writhed. In my ears, all I hear is the concert of chaos and disorder, the sour violins and the bitter piano screaming in high pitches, trying to outsound the other. Joseph's eyebrows folded underneath. "All right then, we'll bury your child, and then what? You're going to cut my arm?" Joseph's foot charged another step forward. "I'm going to give up my limb while we're burying some goddamn food?" I could hear the church bell swinging back and forth, a choir in fortissimo. "Just try." In a quick second, Mr. Martin rose to his feet, his height meeting Joseph's. His fist swung straight into Joseph's face. Joseph kept his footing, his nose leaking drops of blood. He fought back, knocking Mr. Martin to the floor. He wrestled over the old man's chest, laying punches against his cheek. I think of the juice leaking out of tender meat. I stared at Joseph, pounding on Mr. Martin's head, the way the bones of the hand buried against the cheek, turning it to red like pounded beef. It felt like a spell, a requiem forming within me. Blink. Mr. Martin reached for a screwdriver he kept in his pocket as Joseph delivered another swing. Blink. I don't know. I was lost in a trance. My eyes were looking at Sasha. I wasn't really looking at her. I wasn't really listening. She had grabbed me by the shirt and was shaking me back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Blink. "Stop them, Adrian," she was saying. "Adrian!" Blink. Blink. "Get the hell away from my son." I pulled Joseph away from Mr. Martin. He had bludgeoned half of the man's face. Mr. Martin's right eye had swollen half the size of a golf ball. I turned to Joseph. "What were you thinking?" Blink. There was a screwdriver impaled through Joseph's right eye, pierced through his skull. His body fell flat to the floor as I let go. Blink. In my head, I thought a barbecued skewered through a stick. Day 14. The wound is still healing, so don't try to move much or you might bump into something. Sasha wiped wet cloth where my shoulder used to be. She cleaned the bloodstains around, then tied with another cloth. We can't risk another infection, she continued. I failed Junior, but I won't let myself lose another person. I leaned against the wall, looking at the small light that managed to squeeze itself through the tiny cracks. It must be morning now. I wonder how many days it has been. I could see Mr. Martin from a distance, the old man's loathing eyes aimed directly at me, his hand at Joseph's leg between his teeth. "I'm sorry I wasn't able to do anything," I told Sasha. Told, I thought, not apologize. Semantics. I stopped lying to myself that I was not glad of my inaction, that what it deserved wasn't an apology, but gratefulness. It was my inaction that is inside our stomach. It was my inaction that served as hands to pull us from the abyss of starvation. I wanted to tell Mr. Martin that. I wanted to grab the words and shove it to the meatball of those eyes. "We were all in shock," Sasha justified. "His kid just died. My patient just died. And you were still burdened by this." She placed her hand on my shoulder, then my head. "I'm so sorry." Mr. Martin sat beside his son, blood on his hands. I wondered how he could stand the smell, but paid it no attention. He approached them and offered a chunk of Joseph's flesh. "Just don't think about it," I said. I wanted to give the old man back the same pep talk before, back when I offered up my own arm. I thought that it was the least I could do for the man who gave us food. It's done. It happened. Mr. Martin simply shook his head in response. I looked at the old man's beaten eye, swelling and blue, trying to imagine how painful it must have been. But all I could think of was how it would taste like. "You need to eat. We need to eat. Let's stop worrying about anything else for now," I tried to encourage him. "At this moment, the only thing worth of value is our lives, so eat," he insisted. "We can live for days out of Joseph's body." Mr. Martin paused for a brief moment, then turned to him like he was told a bad joke. "What happened to us, Adrian?" he mumbled. "I killed a person, Adrian. I murdered a human being. For God's sake, he should still be alive with us right now. He should still be at that corner trying to make a toilet or a life for us. And I killed him." His eyes were filled with horror, with a watery weight of guilt that hauled the soul from its windows and pulled it down the cheek. "And you made us eat him." I wanted to tell him that it was simply a rational decision, that we did what the situation forced us to do, that we were only playing the cards we were dealt with. But I knew that the old man was past that reality. I could see it in the way Mr. Martin stared at random spaces, as if every pile of rubble gave him an existential thought or a moral crisis. What was real was simple, and I understood it. I understood that we needed to eat, and none of the dust, rocks, or hardware tools were at the very least edible. "Are we still human, Adrian?" the old man asked. He looked at Junior's corpse, lying beside him. "You're a teacher, right? What would you say if I was one of your students?" I tossed a chunk of meat on his lap. "Morality is a privilege of the fortunate. Now stop your drama and eat." Day 13. Mr. Martin lied in a pool of blood, and in his hand was the same handsaw Sasha used to cut Joseph's body. The old man lost it. All I could think about was how fresh the remains were. In my head, that body wasn't the same living, breathing, caring father I knew. At this moment, he was just a corpse. Dead, lifeless, decaying organic matter. Meat. It was simply a rational decision. We needed to maximize what we had. And Sasha, the alive body, could only bury her face in my shoulder, her arms wrapped at the least ray of hope she had. Every inch of her skin was trembling, her hands shaking as they pressed against my back. "We can do this," Sasha assured. But I knew that she had had enough. I knew she could not simply take more. "We can do this," she repeated. But she sounded more like she was trying to believe it herself. For one demented reason, it felt good about having her stuck here with me. Day 18. I found myself being carried to the inside of an ambulance. Beside me was a woman, wiping alcohol to clean the cut on my left arm. "You are Adrian Kaguya, correct?" she asked. I wanted to nod. I wanted to tell her, yes, that's me, and that I survived. But I was not Adrian, at least not anymore. Because Adrian was a cultured, educated man who lived a life so cushioned that survival was never an issue. And inside me, Adrian was already dead. I was barely even a remnant of what Adrian was. "Is there any part of your body that hurts?" "You piece of crap." Adrian would have never said that to someone. Adrian was supposed to be a good young man who was willing to give his left arm to save other people. Adrian wouldn't have had the heart to slaughter Sasha in her sleep. Adrian would have never considered the idea of killing someone just so he could eat. And of course, Adrian would have never survived. Perhaps the proper question to be asked was, why now? It was a magnitude 7 earthquake, enough to crumble Manila and its old set of structures in just a few minutes. The rescuers lacked numbers and were working in small groups. The country didn't have the resources to respond quickly to such a massive catastrophe. Blink. "How did you hold on?" the woman asked. "You're the only person we found alive in this building," she continued. "No offense, but after a month most people would have lost hope. We've seen lots of cases of suicide," she added. "But you cut your own arm so you could eat. I don't have the right words to express how hard that was. How did you survive all of that?" It was an interesting question, and Adrian Kaguya would have never grinned so wide. I found these notes tucked inside an anatomy book I borrowed from our school library. Its previous owner was named Adrian Kaguya, who, after asking my professors and alumni, never existed within the university. The notes had stains of dry blood and smelled like spoiled food. Aside from this, there was never a magnitude 7 earthquake in Manila. My friends and I dismissed it as fiction, written by someone who watched too many psychopath documentaries. That was until, while passing by a mall within my area, in a split second between blinks, I saw the city crumble in itself, then return to normal. I absentmindedly flicked the switch to turn off my computer monitor. It was 5:30 p.m. and I was finally done for the day. I couldn't wait to get out of there. It was Friday and I was eager for the weekend, yearning to wind down and forget about work for a day or two. I work for a publishing house called Raven Mill Books as an editorial assistant, a lifelong dream of mine. I spend most of my day reading. Granted, the stories aren't always compelling, but hey, I still loved immersing myself in the work of others, whatever it may be. I turned to face Patricia, the girl that always sat next to me. I think she was in marketing. I was never sure, and she wasn't very talkative. "I'm done for the day, see you Monday," I said, picking up my handbag. My bag fell from my weak grasp as I glimpsed at her face. She had this permanent grimace that seemed to be fixed in her features. Her mouth was twisted as if she was in pain, and the color of her flesh was that of pure snow. It was as if someone had sculpted her face to be in a perpetual state of fear, but it was her eyes that chilled the blood in my veins. They were a deep, dark red, like 2 little scarlet ruby diamonds, and I could see tiny droplets forming at the edge of her damp eyelashes. Tears. I had never seen fear like it. It was overwhelming. It terrified me. "Pat?" I said meekly. She was so still, so silent, an unmoving statue. I touched her arm and it was cold, hard and rigid. If I didn't know better, and if it weren't for the distorted expression that lined her face, I'd think she was dead. She was looking at something on her screen, something that was making her look and act this way. I tore my gaze away from her ghostly face and directed it toward her screen. It was blank, nothing but white noise and static. What in the hell was she looking at? I wondered to myself. I stood up, hoping to call someone. Anyone. This wasn't normal. I knew that. Perhaps Pat had suffered some sort of breakdown? That thought had crossed my mind, but then I would remember her face, and the fear would grip me tighter than ever. Something wasn't right. When I scanned the room, I nearly passed out. They were all just sitting there, faces glued to their screens, with wet and bleeding eyes. Every single one of them. I saw my friend Triss, over in sales, and her boss Miranda, all wide-eyed and unblinking. I saw Ursula, Ruby, Nathan, and Tom, all my friends, everyone I knew, every single one staring at their computer screens. I walked toward Triss, my eyes filling with tears. Triss? The room was so quiet, so completely still that I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, beating incessantly. It was deafening. Triss didn't respond, didn't even flinch, just continued to sit and stare at her screen, eyes ruby red and weeping. As I neared, I noticed her trembling, ever so slightly, the fear just radiating off her body. She was glowing almost. My hand reached out to touch her auburn hair. It felt dry to the touch, hardened, as if someone had poured wax all over it. My hand traveled down to her shoulder. I prodded it gently. No response. I just about had enough, so I spun her chair around so that she faced me. Triss, snap out of it, I said, shaking her. I stared into her glassy eyes and saw my own horrified face reflected in them. At that moment, she began convulsing violently. Her body shook with a fervor I had never seen before. Her bloodshot eyes rolled in the back of her head, glistening in the pale evening light as she shook. I loosened my grip and stood, watching in horror. I fumbled for my phone, desperate to call the police and the ambulance. I attempted to dial 999, but my heart sank when I saw that there was no reception. My phone lay, defeated in my sweated palm. I looked at the quivering body of Triss, and my eyes widened in horror as I watched her change, morph into something entirely different. Her convulsions had worsened as she had fallen to the floor. Her mouth was grotesquely askew. White foam dribbled from the sides. I could see her veins. They were thick and bulging, a deep, overpowering red. I saw them quiver as the blood coursed through them. Then she screamed. Her mouth opened unbelievably wide, and within I saw that she had bitten her tongue nearly in half. I felt powerless. All I could do was sit there and watch her die from whatever was happening around me. Her veins continued to swell, growing ever bigger, and before I could blink, they exploded. Before she succumbed, I heard her whisper something that sent shivers down my spine. Mom, please. I didn't know why those words escaped her dying mouth. Why was she begging? You see, Triss's mom had been dead for 3 years. She died in a car accident, was impaled by a truck apparently. It was macabre. Before Triss's blood had a chance to dry on my brow, Miranda caught my attention. She was concealed behind her screen so I couldn't see her properly, but I could see the top of her head from where I was. Something about her shrouded demeanor frightened me even more. I knew what she was doing, of course. I already knew that she was glued to her screen like everyone else, but it was what I could hear that sent spikes through my heart. She was laughing. I observed her head, moved up and down like a bobbing apple. I got to my feet, slowly, with my eyes closed. Believe it or not, I was too scared to look. When I did eventually open them, I let out this inhuman howl that I am certain was not my voice. Miranda's face was a ghastly, terrifying sight. Her eyes were unmoving, unblinking, just like the rest of them. But there was something strange and different about her mouth. She was smiling, a wide, unearthly smile that spread from ear to ear. Tears streamed down her face. I could see the dread in her eyes. Why was she smiling? Laughing even? I didn't know, and I don't think I wanted to know. Miranda? I didn't know what else to say. She didn't answer me, of course. Just continued to stare at the nothingness on her screen, laughing quietly, her body trembling. Her laugh grew louder and louder with each passing minute. It was unnatural, like a witch's cackle. It was as if she couldn't catch her breath with each bout of ever-increasing laughter. It was downright creepy. She wouldn't stop. Her laugh became deep, guttural, and dry, as if her throat was parched, as dry as a bone. Then she began choking, hands clawing at her throat. Still, she never once shifted her gaze away from her screen. In between fits of suffocation, she managed to say something. "Philip, why are you doing this to me?" I didn't know Miranda well, so I had no clue who Philip was. Her head fell, hitting her desk with a bang. I heard her skull crack. I was done. I had to get out of there. I rushed downstairs, but when I got there, I realized that I couldn't leave. The doors were sealed shut. I banged and shouted at the door, my salvation just meters away from me, but whatever was happening in this building, it didn't want me to leave. I couldn't leave. Why was I the only one that didn't get affected? I turned my screen off before everyone else. I was sure of that, so it was pure dumb luck. That was when I saw something pale and gangling just out of the corner of my eye, just out of reach. It moved so swiftly, I was sure it was a trick of the light, but it petrified me even more because I knew it wasn't a trick of the light. Something was there, lurking, dwelling in the dark corners of the office, always just out of reach. I felt like I was being watched. Not knowing what else to do, I made my way back to the main desks. I could go nowhere else. When I walked back in, the sight that greeted me was beyond words, beyond anything normal. Every single person in the room was laying face down, face hugging their keyboards. Their heads. Oh my God, their heads. They were all shriveled, like those perfectly preserved shrunken human heads that are used for grotesque rituals. It looked like they had been left out in the sun for too long, all desiccated. The skin was far too tight, the color a dirty brown, mummified. Their eyes were sunken, practically non-existent. A slimy, luminous liquid trickled out of their open mouths. I sunk to the floor, feeling so helpless, the tears falling like raindrops from my tired eyes. What was I to do? Then I heard a voice I hadn't heard in 10 years. "You'll be okay, Delcy. I'm here for you." It was the voice of my brother Timothy. Timothy has been dead for 10 years. I covered my ears. "Please leave me alone." "I can't do that, Delcy. You need to come and look at me. See me." It sounded like my brother, only I knew that it wasn't. I was suddenly overwhelmed by this feeling I couldn't describe, that I didn't recognize. It was a terrifying craving. I wanted to see Timothy. I longed to see him. "Tim, is it really you?" I said, my own voice sounding so alien to me. "It's me, Delcy. Come to me." I saw the hideous shadows again. They have multiplied now, lurking in the corners, but they were getting closer now. Before I could stop myself, I got up and like a robot, I walked toward my computer screen. Nothing else mattered now. My brother's voice whizzed like a roller coaster in my frazzled mind, so quiet and yet so convincing. I knew what I had to do. I just didn't know if I could do it. I'm sitting by my computer screen now. I haven't turned it on yet. I don't know what time it is. I do know that everyone around is now dead. I still can't get out, and I still can't call the police. I'm writing this on my phone because I want there to be a record of what's happened here today, just in case I don't make it. There is only one thing left for me to do. I know that now. I realize it, and I feel it in my heart, pulsating like a tumor. The one way out is to look.